The sound of the helicopter did not fade away immediately. It slowly died away in space, leaving behind a deafening, almost physical emptiness, which was immediately filled by the wind from the Arctic Ocean. Ivan Andreevich Belov, 48 years old, nicknamed Raven, stood on the rickety pier of the village of Zakamensky. And this transition from the roar of the machine to absolute Arctic silence pressed on his eardrums with a force equal to a 1,000-ton slab. He had come here not of his own free will, and not out of love for foreign shores, but for the only reason he was usually called upon. The criminal's trail ended where human laws ended, and a different, natural order began. The local police, helplessly treading water, needed someone who could read the land and snow, not just paper reports. Voron was a man whose biography was a map of retreat from civilization. A former senior state inspector of the Cyan Nature Reserve, he left his post after his internal code of honor came into irreconcilable conflict with the interests of the powers that be. Now he was a freelance consultant, a man who came when the trail went off the road into the Taiga wilderness, or now into the icy desert. The hustle and bustle of the city, politics and lies, were left behind in a world he considered sick and twisted. His territory was the endless expanses, and the crimes he solved always had a taste of damp earth, gunpowder, and primal fear. He dressed as usual, functional clothing that had seen dozens of kilometers of taiga, an old hunting knife, binoculars that he never let out of his hands, and, of course, his faithful West Siberian Laika dog named Shadow. The dog pressed against his leg, sniffing intently at the wet, salty boards of the pier and the sharp smell of ice, foreign to the Siberian swamps. Shadow was the only creature Voron trusted unconditionally. The village of Zakamensky, nestled at the edge of the world, was carved out of stone and painted in dull, faded colors that tried to compete with the grayness of the ocean. The low, squat houses seemed to be pressed into the ground to withstand the fury of winter storms. Ivan Andreevich immediately sensed something was wrong. There were no signs of the usual northern chaos. No piles of neatly stacked firewood. No chattering women at the well. No loud music from the only bar. The village was suspiciously clean and quiet. The snow covering the narrow streets looked untouched, as if people had deliberately avoided it. It was not calmness, but secrecy. Every resident who came out to look at the stranger hid their eyes, as if they were not looking at a person, but watching a predator that had entered foreign territory. Ivan Andreevich always spoke little and slowly, in a low, hoarse voice, as if every word had weight and should not be wasted. Now he did not want to speak at all. A young man, with a weather-beaten but overly clean face, came out of a small building, decorated with a slightly crooked sign that read, District Police Station. He was wearing a uniform jacket that was clearly not suited for such windy weather. It was Junior Lieutenant Glebov, the same one who had sent a desperate request to the regional center, which had made its way up the chain of command to Voron. Glebov nervously clutched a leather folder. He looked as if he had been pulled out of a warm office and thrown into an ice bath. Ivan Andreevich Belov, thank you for coming. I'm Glebov, Vladimir. We can't make sense of the tracks. There's just nothing that adds up. The lieutenant's voice trembled, not only from the cold, but also from tension. Voron just nodded. His heavy, calm gaze, which had earned him his nickname, studied Glebov intently. To him, this young man was not a representative of the law, but just another weak individual, incapable of understanding the language of nature. "Okay," was all Raven said, nodding toward the old SUV parked by the station building.
As they drove to the lighthouse, located a couple of kilometers from the village, Belov finally spoke, incoherently explaining the facts of the case.
The body of a local hunter and trapper, Nikolai Zakharov, had been found at an old abandoned lighthouse on the ocean shore. Death had apparently been caused by a blow with a blunt object, but the circumstances were extremely unclear.
Zakharov was a strong, experienced man. No one could understand what he was doing at the lighthouse in such weather, and alone at that.
Ivan Andreevich, the main thing is that everyone is talking about the ghosts. Glebov lowered his voice, although there was only a dog in the wind in the car besides them. Zakharov was the last person to see him alive, according to legend, 30 years ago. And now, he's found dead in the same place, right by the lighthouse. Voron showed no interest in the mystical aspect. For him, legends were just a form of collective fear, and fear always made people make mistakes.
The ghost of the lighthouse was a surviving member of the crew of a sunken ship who, according to stories, was unable to return to the world of humans, and over the years became part of the icy landscape.
He had become so wild, so adapted, that he could no longer be distinguished from a rock or a shadow. For Raven, this was not a challenge to mysticism, but to the logic of survival. Could a person really blend in with the Arctic so much that they could disrupt the natural order of things and remain invisible? They drove up to the lighthouse. It was a gloomy tower made of wild stone that had not seen paint in a long time.
Its glass,
Which had once served as a guiding light, was now cloudy and blind. The lighthouse stood on a cape where the rocky shore abruptly gave way to a grey, foaming strip of surf, and beyond that, to the edge of thick but broken fast ice, stretching into the white infinity of the ocean. It was the perfect place for a crime. No witnesses, no traces except those left by the killer himself, which the wind could erase in a matter of hours. Glebov pointed to a stain on the rocks at the base of the tower. That's where he was lying. The body has already been taken away, but the location has been recorded. Apparently. Voron got out of the car, and Shadow immediately jumped out after him, sniffing the air. The cold was not just low temperature. It was palpable, penetrating to the bone, and carried with it the smell of salt, seaweed, and something animalistic, wild. Ivan Andreevich did not approach the spot. Instead, he slowly walked along the shoreline, his hands in his pockets and his head down. He was not examining the crime scene. He was listening to it. He was not looking for clues, but for a story, written in stone. The environment was completely hostile. The rocks, pounded into the ground by years of storms, did not retain normal footprints, and the sparse snow was as hard as sandpaper. Glebov, following behind him, tried to explain how they conducted their search. We were looking for tracks, mainly in the snow, from the lighthouse to the village. But nothing, only ours and his. Voron, without turning around, stopped him with a slight movement of his hand. Quiet. He knelt on one knee at the edge of the stones, where the wet pebbles began. His gaze, heavy and attentive, like that of a bird of prey, glided over the surface. He ignored the large boot prints and focused on the barely discernible changes. For him, the forest, and now the shore, was an open book. And now that book began with words about movement and fear. He saw how a stone had been slightly moved in one place, how tiny ice crystals had been disturbed in a certain
unnatural way. He spent several minutes in complete silence, watching the shadow sniff the area, showing no interest in the smell of dead flesh, but focusing on something else, something more subtle. The raven rose. He already knew more than Belov had in 2 days of searching. He knew that 2 people had come to the lighthouse, the victim and another person, and he already knew that only one had left, the second person. The raven's voice was hoarse and low. Where did he go? Belov spread his hands. A ghost, Ivan Andreevich. A legend. Voron shifted his gaze from the lieutenant to the ocean, to the edge of the fast ice, where the dry shore ended and the endless cold element began. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in logic. And if a person's tracks disappeared on rock and ice, it could only mean one thing. That person knew how to adapt to this environment better than anyone else. He knew how to disrupt the natural order of things so as to remain invisible to the human eye. Voron felt the tension inside him rise. This would not be just an investigation. It would be a confrontation with pure, wild adaptation. Show me the body, Raven said, taking a step toward the lighthouse. He had to see the injuries inflicted by this person, or not this person. He had to understand the logic behind the killer's actions. The logic of a predator, the logic of fear, or the logic of greed. The icy desert was just beginning to reveal its story to him. They were driving along a road that could hardly be called a road. A rutted track carved into the ice and covered with dirty snow. Winding among low, wind-blown bushes, Belov's SUV shook so much that the case file lying on the dashboard bounced rhythmically, as if beating a nervous beat. Outside the window lay a landscape that Voron could call honest. There was no room for pretense here. The icy ocean stretching to the horizon promised nothing but cold and death, and the ground beneath the wheels was hard and uncompromising. Belov, despite his uniform jacket and official position, looked lost. He was not afraid of the cold or the dead man. He was afraid of the legend. Rumors, Ivan Andreevich, are the worst thing, he muttered, slowing down before a sharp turn that led to the lighthouse. If Zakharov had simply fallen off the rocks, I would have closed the case. But here in the village, every second person is ready to swear that it was the work of the ghost, that he returned to take away the one who saw him. Voron did not answer. He looked ahead. For him, rumors were just a cloud of steam hiding the real clues. The ghost, the legend, the mysticism. All of this had a biological basis, either a person, a predator, or a disease that needed to be removed from the system. The lighthouse finally appeared in all its grim power. It stood on a separate stone ledge, gnawed by thousands of storms. It was not the romantic tower described in books, but a harsh, black cylinder of wild stone, confused by time. It seemed enormous, but at the same time oppressed by the endless space around it. Raven felt its silent, deafening hostility. People don't come here just like that. They come here out of necessity, or by a fateful coincidence. Belov stopped the car about 50 meters from the tower, not daring to drive any closer. The Raven got out. Stepping onto the rocky, icy ground, the shadow stopped fidgeting. Laika immediately went into hunting mode, a slow, purposeful sniff, listening attentively to the wind that carried the smells from the lighthouse. The shadow read the territory, and Raven read the shadow. The dog's behavior suggested that there was something alien here. but not necessarily dangerous at the moment.
The crime scene was hastily cordoned off with red and white tape, which fluttered in the wind like an old flag. There was no point in approaching the tape, because the entire area around the lighthouse was littered with clumsy footprints left by Belov and his men, as well as tire tracks from an SUV. Voron watched this vandalism with poorly concealed contempt. How could anyone defile a place where every change in the surface screamed about what had happened? But he didn't waste words on reproach. For him, these city amateurs were just part of the landscape that he had to filter out. Here, Ivan Andreevich, right at the base, here, where the blood is. Belov pointed to a dark brown stain on the stones, partially covered by fresh snow. The stain was small, but its location seemed to indicate that the victim had not simply fallen, but had been pressed against the base of the lighthouse. Voron did not look at the stain. Blood was a fact, a consequence. He was always interested in the cause, the action. He walked around the stain without stepping on it, and stopped on the side where, logically, the body should have been directed. He crouched down. The rocks here were covered with a thin, transparent crust of ice, speckled with sea spray. Under the layer of ice, he saw something that instantly distracted Belov from his attention. It was not just an imprint of the body, it was an imprint of a pose that the body had assumed at the moment of impact, or immediately after it. The posture. Voron exhaled hoarsely. Describe his position when you found him. Before you started moving him. Belov seemed surprised by the question, but his memory proved to be good. On his side, Ivan Andreevich, as if curled up. His arms were around his head, but not in a defensive position, as if he was hugging his head. Voron nodded, his gaze, heavy as Arctic ice, shifting to a barely noticeable crack in the rock, located about half a meter from the bloodstain. The victim, Nikolai Zakharov, was an experienced hunter and trapper, a strong man who was used to fighting in danger. But the posture described by Belov was not that of a fighter. It was not a block. It was the posture of a man who realized the inevitability of the blow, but did not have time to decide to resist, and instinctively tried to protect his brain. An accident is out of the question, concluded Voron, addressing no one in particular. His words were merely a statement of fact. If Zakharov had fallen from a height, or slipped on the icy stairs of the lighthouse, his body would have been lying differently. The position of the body indicated sudden, deliberate aggression. Voron stood up and held out his hand to Belov. The papers. Belov quickly handed him the folder. Voron took out the photos taken at the scene before the body was removed. He did not bother to read the terse, official lines of the death certificate. He studied only the photographs with a focus worthy of a microscope. Zakharov's face was calm, almost serene, which was strange for a man who had suffered a fatal blow. But it was this calmness that gave Voron an idea. Blow, said Voron, pointing to the photograph of the back of the head. Clear, strong, with a blunt object. The blow was delivered from behind or from the side, from top to bottom. He looked around carefully. There were no signs of dragging, no signs of a struggle, except for the posture. If the blow had been delivered from behind and above, it ruled out direct conflict. It was a clean, cold, almost professional execution, not an emotional quarrel. But to deliver such a blow to a hunter, one would need either incredible surprise or knowledge of his habits, perhaps both. And Raven knew that in the Arctic, as in his Taiga, Professionalism in killing always meant adaptation.
Adaptation to conditions that make the victim vulnerable.
And adaptation to leaving behind a minimum of traces. He knelt down again, but this time at the base of the tower, at the edge of that very spot.
The stones here were rough,
But in one place he felt a strange smoothness. He took out the binoculars he always carried with him, and despite their intended purpose, used them as a magnifying glass, holding them up to the stone.
the smooth surface had barely noticeable microscopic scratches,
Parallel to each other, very thin, but deep. Not a fool, Raven whispered.
He was pushed.
The scratches could have been left by some metal object on Zakarov's clothing when his body was thrown with full force onto the rock. Or he himself could have tried to hold on, sliding down the vertical wall of the lighthouse.
But if he was thrown, then by whom? And with what?
He looked up, and his gaze slid up the gray stone of the lighthouse. Right at chest level, about 2 meters high, he noticed a tiny, almost invisible but fresh chip. A small dent in the stone that looked unnaturally white against the backdrop of years of gray patina. The Raven felt his heartbeat quicken. Not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. The killer hadn't just struck a blow. The killer had used the very structure of the lighthouse. A person capable of killing an experienced hunter with a single blow, leaving no traces, and using the environment as a weapon, is not just a criminal.
This is a creature adapted to the Arctic.
This is the perfect predator. Belov, seeing that Voron had frozen, couldn't hold back. What do you see there, Ivan Andreevich? Could it be
A ghost?
Voron slowly lowered his binoculars, his gaze heavy as lead. He looked not at Belov, but through him, at the line of fast ice where the grey rock of the shore suddenly ended. I see tracks, Vladimir, Voron replied quietly.
Tracks that aren't there.
The victim came. The killer came. The victim stayed. And the killer left, without leaving a single footprint on the way back. He knew that this man could not have vanished into thin air. He must have used the laws of physics, taking advantage of the unique surface of the rocks and ice to conceal his movements. He had violated the natural order by becoming invisible. Let's look at his clothes and equipment at the station, said Raven. We need to understand why he came here and what he was carrying. And then I'll read the ice. They returned to the car. Raven took a brief but penetrating look at the edge of the ice. Now he knew that the legend of the ghost was not about a spirit, but about a man who had learned to be part of the wilderness, the perfect killer, and the perfect fugitive. In this village, full of fear and lies, he had to find someone who had learned the laws of survival too well. The temporary morgue in the village of Zakamensky was located in a cold, poorly heated warehouse that smelled of both fish and formaldehyde. Here, in the dim light of a single lamp, Raven studied not Nikolai Zakharov's body, but his shell, his clothes and equipment. For him, it was part of the same book he had been reading on the shore. Clothes always reveal more about a person's intentions than their words. Zakharov was dressed well. A thick wool sweater, a thick canvas fishing jacket over it, and tall, heavy boots on his feet. All this spoke of a long, serious trip, not a short walk. However, when Voron examined the canvas jacket closely, he found an anomaly. On the sleeves, and especially on the right shoulder,
There were traces of mechanical abrasion, not from wear, but from constant contact with something heavy and sharp that was regularly carried on that shoulder. It was not a trace from a rifle. Such traces were different, more rounded. It was something straight, possibly a wooden or metal object. Belov, standing nearby and feeling completely out of place, timidly asked, "His backpack was empty, Ivan Andreevich. We only found an empty thermos and some crackers. Maybe he was carrying something that he dropped along the way?" Voron shook his head without even looking at the lieutenant. He was carrying something there, something very heavy, possibly long, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. Zakharov came to the lighthouse with this object. Where'd it gone? Was it a tool for opening the cache? Or perhaps a weapon? In any case, it meant that Zakharov was not a victim who had accidentally stumbled upon the ghost. He was walking to the lighthouse with a specific purpose, armed and prepared. Next, Voron examined the boots. A hunter, a man who depends on his feet, always takes good care of his footwear. The boots were in good condition, but Voron noticed strange, artificial notches on the leather soles, barely noticeable and uneven, apparently not made in a factory. Such notches could have been made for better traction on ice or slippery rock. This confirmed Voron's theory. Zakharov expected to have to move across the most difficult surface, fast ice. He wasn't just going to the lighthouse. He was going beyond the lighthouse, to the ocean. Leaving Glebov with his papers, Voron returned to the lighthouse, taking only Shadow with him. Now he wasn't just examining the place. He was entering into a silent dialogue with the surface. This time, he did not look at the blood and the torn tape, but focused on the narrow strip between the base of the tower and the edge of the fast ice. This strip was a realm of chaos, a jumble of wet pebbles, boulders, icy sand, and glass-hard sediment. It was the perfect filter for footprints. The sun, low and dim, gave no warmth, but illuminated every unevenness. The raven moved slowly, like a living pendulum, measuring each step. He retraced Zakharov's path, from the approach track to the place where he was found. On the icy boulders, he found 3 clear, though quickly fading footprints from Zakharov's boots. On 2 of the footprints, in the middle of the imprint, there were barely noticeable indentations, indicating that the hunter was walking heavily, carrying that very unknown object on his shoulder. He was focused, but not calm. His footing was a little hurried, which for an experienced taiga dweller or hunter was a sign of inner tension. Zakharov was walking toward the lighthouse, knowing that he might encounter resistance. Voron reached the edge where the rocky shore abruptly ended, giving way to a field of fast ice. Here, Zakharov's tracks ended with a sharp, sudden jerk, which could mean either the beginning of a struggle or an attempt to dodge a blow. Next to the victim's last footprint, Voron found another imprint. It was another person's footprint. Not a boot, but something lighter, perhaps a boot or shoe specially adapted for walking on ice. The footprint was much less pronounced because the foot placement was different. Not striking, as with a typical city dweller, but sliding, economical. The person did not move in a human way. They did not push off from the ground, but used inertia, shifting their body weight in such a way as to minimize pressure on the surface. Raven instantly processed this information. A person who walks like this does not live in the village. They live in nature. Voron followed these tracks. They meandered, but not chaotically, rather purposefully, leading straight to the lighthouse and back. but only to a certain point, and then an anomaly was discovered that Glebov could not explain, and that forced the raven to work to the limit of his abilities. There were traces of a second person, leading to the scene of the crime. They intersected with Zakharov's tracks, confirming that they had met. But there were no return tracks, not a single one. He returned, combing the same area twice more, crawling on his knees, using his binoculars as a magnifying glass.
The shadow, which had been silently following its master until then, suddenly tensed and began to sniff the space between two boulders, then raised its muzzle and let out a low, uncertain whimper. The dog had smelled something that didn't make sense. It was a scent that should have disappeared, but hadn't. The raven ignored the smell and focused on physics. Where could the man have gone? He couldn't have evaporated. The first thought that came to Glebov's mind was that the ghost had gone out onto the distant ice or into the water. The raven looked at the ice floe. The ice was solid, but its surface was broken, and anyone would have left tracks on it, even if they were walking on light skis. Moreover, going out onto the ice immediately after the murder, knowing that a pursuit might begin, would be extremely illogical and dangerous. Second thought. The killer returned to the village wearing some kind of special footwear that erased his tracks. But even the most sophisticated footwear leaves an imprint, albeit a faint one, on icy pebbles and wet sand. And then, Raven found what he was looking for. A narrow, almost vertical crevice between two huge boulders, covered with tough, perennial moss. In the very depths of the crevice, where neither wind nor snow could reach, he discovered a tiny, perfectly flat strip of moss that was bent upward. It was as if something narrow and thin, but very hard, had passed through here from bottom to top. It was not just a crack, it was a tunnel, hidden from prying eyes. The raven looked at the boulders. They were huge and immovable, but on the upper rock facing the sea, he noticed a barely noticeable, light-colored scuff that he had previously mistaken for a natural chip. Now, knowing about the tunnel, he understood. The killer had come out of the crevice, then, instead of stepping onto the ground, had done the unthinkable. He had climbed onto this boulder along an almost vertical wall. It was at that moment that Raven realized that the ghost was not a myth. This was a man who had completely adapted himself to this hostile environment. He used the slightest irregularities, protrusions, and moss to climb, like a mountaineer. Most importantly, he used boulders and crevices to cross the ice without leaving any traces on the very edge of the shore. He didn't walk on the surface, he slipped through it. The raven rose. He was struck by the realization that the man he was looking for possessed not just survival skills, but a predatory instinct and knowledge of the territory that made him part of the landscape. This was not a killer who had made a mistake, but a perfect fugitive who had committed murder to preserve his order. And that order was now broken, because Raven had seen what should not have been seen. He turned toward the ocean. The wind ruffled his graying hair. He didn't leave. He came back, Raven whispered. He came back using the laws he himself created. He was no longer looking for the ghost spirit. He was looking for a man who had been able to adapt to the harsh conditions of the Arctic, disrupting the natural order of things and becoming a sick individual in the ecosystem who needed to be removed. Now his path lay not back to the station, but further along the edge of the ice to where the trail began.
and led to the legend. Returning to the village of Zakamensky, Voron immediately felt the suffocating density of silence after the icy honesty of the ocean and stone. Human secrecy seemed dirty and sticky. The killer had not disappeared into thin air. He had taken advantage of the peculiarities of the landscape, and this landscape seemed to include the inhabitants themselves.
The village was a trap, not only because of its geographical location, but also because of the web of lies that had enveloped it since its foundation. Voron understood that in order to find the ghost, he must first destroy this web.
He began his investigation, working directly from the police station. Lieutenant Glebov tried to help, but his protocol approach only provoked indifference or irritation among the residents. Voron used his own method, combining survival psychology and the observation skills of a predator. He didn't ask, "Where were you?" He asked, "How did you feel when you found out?" The first was old Anna Ignatievna, the last unofficial keeper of the lighthouse and the main guardian of local legends. She lived in an old frozen house, hung with dried grass and salt-covered photographs. At the sight of Voron, she crossed her arms over her chest, as if protecting herself from evil spirits. "What? Am I supposed to tell you to believe in fairy tales?" she croaked, her voice as harsh as frozen fish. Kolka Zakharov found him himself, 30 years ago. The ghost. And since then, he's been waiting for retribution. Anna Ignatievna was not talking about a person, but about retribution, about a disturbed balance. She described the ghost not as a sailor, but as an element of wild nature that Zakharov had once disturbed. A survivor, you say? What survivor? It wasn't a man who settled in the lighthouse, but the law. She said that since then, Zakharov had lived in constant, quiet fear, periodically going to the lighthouse to take him something, and always returning empty-handed. Voron listened attentively, noting that this woman's fear was genuine. But it was a fear of the supernatural, not of a man who might be sitting around the corner. Then the raven summoned Maxim Zakharov, the son of the murdered man. Maxim was a man of about 30, depressed, with a dull look in his eyes. He worked as a mechanic on the only fishing boat in the village. Unlike the old woman, Maxim did not speak of the ghost as something mystical, but his answers were formulaic and memorized. "My father was a good man. He never quarreled with anyone. It was just an old legend that ruined him." When Voron mentioned the object that Zakharov Sr. was carrying to the lighthouse, Maxim showed emotion for the first time. A slight tremor in his fingers as he gripped the edge of the table. "He wasn't carrying anything," his son stubbornly repeated. "Just his gun as usual, to calm his nerves." Sometimes he would go there just to let off steam. He was a hunter. What can you expect? But Voron, reading Maxim's body language, could see that he knew his father had been carrying something heavy. He was hiding something, but not to protect the killer, but to protect his father's memory, or what his father was looking for. Voron decided not to press the issue, leaving a seed of doubt in him. The key figure at the center of the village's web was Arkady Sviridov, the owner of the only store in Zakamenskoye and, in essence, its unofficial leader. Sviridov's store was the center of life. Everything from kerosene to canned goods was sold here, and all transactions took place here. Sviridov was the complete opposite of the harsh, weather-beaten residents. He was overweight, ruddy-faced, with a keen, quick gaze that constantly scanned the space around him. Arkady greeted Voron with strained politeness, his voice betraying the condescension of a city dweller toward a savage. "Ivan Andreevich, I understand why you were called here.
We have a lot of superstitions here.
This ghost is a figment of the imagination, of course. Kalka was just obsessed. There are no drugs here, only my alcohol, which is legal.
It was pure murder. The motive was domestic robbery, nothing more. Voron didn't believe a word.
He looked around the store. The room was crammed with goods, which was strange for such a small and poor village. Among the usual goods were expensive imported canned goods that shouldn't have been there. Voron applied his method of reading traces to the man, not the ground. He noticed how Sviridov involuntarily adjusted the box of fishing nets that was standing too close to the back wall, and his nervous tick when Voron mentioned the old sunken ships. "Robbery, you say?" Raven asked, his voice low and hoarse.
But Zakharov didn't have any money on him. And if the killer was looking for loot, he wouldn't have left such perfect traces. Raven leaned toward the counter, his gaze heavy.
Don't you think, Arkady, that the legend of the ghost is very convenient for those who don't want people asking too many questions about what's going on behind the lighthouse? Sviridov paled. His blush faded, leaving gray spots on his face.
"What do you mean, Ivan Andreevich?" His tone became wary. "I mean order," Voron replied. "In nature, if a sick animal appears that disrupts the balance, it must be removed.
And in a village, if someone controls fear in order to control people, that is also a disruption. You use this legend, Arkady. You convince people that murder is mystical, while you yourself are engaged in something that fears the light of day. Smuggling, illegal fishing. Voron understood that Zakamensky lived by his own unspoken Arctic laws. The criminal code did not apply here, but the code of survival did, which Sviridov had distorted to his advantage. Fear of the ghost was the perfect tool of control. It kept people from making long trips to the lighthouse, from curiosity, from looking for alternative sources of income other than Sviridov's store. Arkady was not a murderer, but he was part of the very sick mechanism that Voron had come to stop. "I'm not going to look for who among you is greedy, Arkady," said Voron, stepping away from the counter. "I'm looking for the one who left a mark on the stone, and the one who violated natural justice. But know this. Anyone who hides the truth about what Zakharov was looking for at the lighthouse becomes an accomplice. In the Taiga, and here by the ocean, the law is simple. If you upset the balance, sooner or later, you will be taken away." Voron left the store, leaving Sviridov in a cold sweat among his canned goods. The shadow waited for him on the street, watching the windows of the houses closely. The village of Zakamensky was not just a village, but a well-disguised trap. And to find a way out, Voron needed to understand what exactly Zakharov, the last person to see the ghost, was trying to take from him. Not just find, but take. Voron returned to the police station, where Glebov was trying to balance the books. He took out his binoculars. Evening fell, and the icy desert outside the window took on a leaden hue. "Plebov," said Voron, his low voice unusually firm. "Let's look for the story of a sunken ship, the ghost's name. If he's human, he has a name, and he has a motive that's not related to the legend. Zakharov didn't have a gun with him, but a tool to open something. Something that the ghost had been guarding for 30 years. Voron looked at the map. His territory was not the Taiga, but the border where man ended and beast began. And now he was standing right on that border. After talking to Sviridov and Maxim Zakharov, Voron realized that he needed to extract not facts, but myths from the village in order to clear them of the falsehoods that had been added. In the evening, while Belov read with tension, unsuccessfully tried to find references to ships sunk at these coordinates in the old archives, Voron decided to return to the original source of the legend. Anna Ignatievna. She wasn't lying. She simply believed what was more convenient and safer for her to believe. He came to her without Glebov, without his official uniform, with only binoculars around his neck and Shadow, who lay quietly by the stove, as if guarding it. Anna Ignatievna gave him strong herbal tea that smelled of northern summer and salt. She spoke slowly, immersing herself in her memories as if in icy water. It was in 47, she began, looking at the fire reflected in the old photographs. A German ship, smugglers or a scientific expedition, who can tell? It crashed into the glacier during a storm. The entire crew died, except for one. They found him, or didn't find him. It's just that his belongings were washed ashore. And then people started seeing him near the lighthouse. Voron nodded silently. The year was 1947. It was a time of post-war chaos, when borders were blurred and all sorts of shady dealings could take place in the Arctic. Captain or sailor? Voron asked. I don't know. They called him the Ghost because he didn't age, didn't eat, didn't drink. People saw him in the fog, standing by the water. And then he would disappear, like smoke. And anyone who tried to approach him was doomed. The worst thing that could happen was when the ghost took away your sanity. Kolka Zakharov saw him. Or thought he saw him. The Raven took the main point from her story. Zakharov saw the ghost 30 years ago, and since then he had lived in fear, but also in some kind of obsession. He wasn't just afraid. He, according to the old woman, carried something for him. This did not fit into the logic of robbery or mystical retribution. It was more like a tribute or atonement. Anna Ignatievna. Voron's voice was soft but heavy. Let's imagine that he is not a ghost but a man, very strong, very lonely. He survived in the Arctic, alone. Voron paused to allow her mind to accept this terrifying reality. To survive here alone, you have to forget that you are human. You have to become a beast, a predator who knows this land better than any hunter. Could that be possible? The old woman shuddered. For her, this was even more frightening than mysticism. Mysticism could be explained by fate. But a man who had become wild, just a stone's throw from the village, was a real and tangible threat. The Raven continued, analyzing the situation from the point of view of survival psychology and the logic of the wild. A person can adapt to incredible conditions if they have two factors, a strong will and a constant source of energy. This village has neither. But if he survived, it means he found a place where there are no people, where there is food, and where there is shelter inaccessible to the unprepared. He explained that if the ghost was a human being, he had to learn to move differently from how people walk. He had to use instincts rather than logic. His footprints on the rocks that Raven saw near the lighthouse were not ghost footprints, but camouflage footprints. He doesn't disappear, Anna Ignatievna.
He just knows how to use gravity, wind, and the structure of ice to make his tracks disappear in a minute.
He doesn't sleep like a human being. He sleeps like an animal. In short, frequent periods, so that he is always on the alert. His diet is not canned food from Zvirodov's store, but what the sea gives him. The hunt he conducts in complete solitude. And here, Zakharov, he broke his law. Voron returned to the central idea. The ghost did not take revenge on Zakharov for seeing him, but for taking something from him, or trying to take something from him. What could be valuable to a man who has renounced the world? The only value for a man who has survived in the wild and renounced society is his territory and his secret, said Voron. His innermost thoughts. What allowed him to survive and remain invisible? Maybe it was his shelter. Maybe his supplies. Or maybe... Voron leaned forward, his grey, piercing eyes fixed on the old woman. Maybe it's something he found on the sunken ship. Anna Ignatievna brushed invisible dust from the old photograph. They say the ship was carrying more than just supplies. They say it was carrying treasure. Something that cost the captain and the entire crew their lives. This is where mysticism merged with reality. The ghost was not guarding his own secret, but a treasure that allowed him to maintain his independence. Zakharov, who saw him 30 years ago, apparently stumbled upon this secret and lived with an obsession trying to unravel it. It was not a gun, but a tool to open something. That was what Zakharov was carrying to the lighthouse. He was going after the treasure, which, according to the laws of the Arctic, no longer belonged to him, but to the man who had survived for its sake. Voron thanked the old woman. He left the house, and the cold Arctic air burned his lungs. Now he knew what he was looking for. Not a murderer in the usual sense, but a guardian. A man who had broken human laws to preserve the natural order. The order of his own survival. Returning to the police station, Voron found Glebov hunched over a stack of papers. Did you find it? The ship? Glebov looked up wearily. I found it, Ivan Andreevich. The ship was called the Arctic Wind. It disappeared without a trace in 1946. It was officially declared lost. But there's a strange note in the documents. The cargo lists mention a certain scientific collection. No details. Marked top secret. Voron approached the map. The Arctic was vast, but the ghost had a territory tied to the lighthouse. And he had treasure. Not gold, but a scientific collection marked as secret. It could be anything. Minerals, rare metals, or, worse, something dangerous. Zakharov, Ghost, and even Sviridov were probably all hunting for it. Ivan Andreevich, Glebov pointed uncertainly at the coordinates. In the interrogation reports we've collected, all the residents of Zakamensky say that in recent years Zakharov became obsessed with the idea that the ghost kept his stash inside the lighthouse. That the lighthouse was not just his refuge, but his safe. Voron narrowed his eyes. The balance had been upset. Now he had to find the Arctic Wind and figure out what it was carrying in order to understand what the ghost was guarding. But first, he had to check the lighthouse itself. A lighthouse is not just a landmark. It is a symbol, a repository. And if the ghost had broken human law by making it his refuge, then Raven had to break his law by going inside. Tomorrow, he would go to the lighthouse, and Shadow would go with him, not to find mysticism, but traces of long,
almost animalistic habitation.
The morning on the shore of the Arctic Ocean brought not warmth but the fury of the wind, which stripped the last hope for calm from the rocks and ice. The sun hung low, casting long, deceptive shadows. Raven and Shadow were back at the lighthouse. But now their goal was not the scene of the crime, but the path of retreat. Raven was convinced that the ghost had not gone deep into the village, but had used the ice and slush to camouflage himself as he returned to his territory. The traces of the ghost that he had discovered yesterday in the crevice between the boulders were his first real clue. They pointed to a vertical, almost impossible climb that could only have been made by someone who constantly practiced climbing in these conditions. Now Raven had to find where these tracks led next, onto the ice field, and prove that his opponent was not a spirit, but a traitor to the human race, who had become part of the wild. Raven tied a safety rope around his arm, which he attached to an old anchor ring at the base of the lighthouse. He wasn't afraid of ice, but he respected it. Ice is the most honest of trackers. It either preserves a footprint intact or destroys it completely. The ice near the shore was covered with ridges as sharp as teeth. The shadow moved ahead with incredible caution, its paws barely disturbing the surface. The dog sensed that it was walking on unfamiliar and very dangerous territory. Raven moved along the edge where the ice merged with the rock, scanning the space with a gaze trained to ignore the large and notice the microscopic. People, especially in the city, look for the obvious. A shoe print, a broken branch. But in the wild, the most important thing is what is not there, or what is barely noticeable. After 20 minutes of intense searching, Raven stopped. At the edge of the ice field, where the wind constantly blew away the snow dust, there was bare, old ice tinged with blue. On it, where a person would have sunk or left a deep footprint, Raven discovered a series of almost weightless, long scratches. These were not drag marks, nor were they fall marks. They were sliding marks. Raven knelt down. The scratches were at a strange angle, as if the person had moved, distributing their weight so that contact with the surface was minimal, and each movement used inertia rather than force. It was not a normal step. It was a technique, a way of conserving energy. He didn't run. He flowed across the ice, Raven whispered, like water seeking the path of least resistance. The scratches did not run straight, but looped. But Raven quickly understood the logic of these loops. They were laid around the thinnest places, and directed to where the ice was covered with hard, compacted snow that he could use as support. No one from Zakamensky who used snowmobiles or boats would have moved like this. This was a man for whom the ice itself was a tool, not an obstacle. The next discovery was the remains of food. On one of the ice ridges, in a small niche sheltered from the wind, the shadow began to dig excitedly. Raven approached and found a handful of half-digested fish bones, and next to them, the tough, dried skin of some kind of berry or fruit that did not grow in the Arctic. The bones had been thoroughly gnawed, and the remains of non-local food suggested that the ghost was not completely cut off from civilization, but that he ate like an animal, quickly, without leaving any leftovers, and in hiding. The Raven picked up the dried skin. It could only have been brought from the south, which meant that the ghost either had occasional contact with smugglers, such as Sviridov, or had his own very old and well-hidden supply. And again, this took him beyond the realm of mysticism and into the realm of crime. Ghost had resources and connections. Moving on, Raven began to notice what he called territory marks. These were not tracks, but rather the absence of tracks where they should have been. The stones and boulders on the shore,
which could have served as excellent cover, showed no signs of presence. Ghost, like a beast, marked his territory, leaving it empty and clean. But away from the shore, in a small snowdrift between the ice floes, Raven discovered barely noticeable, old, camouflaged shelters. These were not houses, but rather lays, places where one could wait out the bad weather without leaving large traces. They were primitive, but fit perfectly into the landscape.
The shelter was a cleverly camouflaged entrance to a snowdrift, reinforced with 3 pieces of flat slate that provided ventilation, but were not visible from the outside.
Inside, in a deep snow pit, it was lined with old, stiff moss and some kind of fur that Raven identified as seal. It was a lifestyle completely detached from society, but one that required incredible discipline and knowledge.
Raven paused, looking at this primitive but perfect shelter. He felt not hatred for the ghost, but a deep, professional respect. This man had survived by turning his life into an endless hunt, but he had managed to retain his sanity.
He had not degenerated into a wild animal, but had adapted to the level of a top predator.
He broke human law, Shadow, Raven said quietly, petting the dog. But he obeyed the law of survival in the Arctic.
He became someone who uses it to hide his actions, and that is a violation of order.
Raven clearly understood his conclusion. The ghost was not a myth. He was a man who used the laws of nature to survive and conceal his actions.
A violation of order. Zakarov's murder was not an act of madness, but an act of territorial defense.
Zakharov, walking toward the lighthouse with a tool for opening it, was not a person to the ghost, but a threat that had to be eliminated in order to maintain the balance of his own life.
Moving further along the ice, Raven noticed that the ghost's tracks were becoming clearer, but at the same time more calculated. They led to a cape where the glacier jutted out, creating a natural windbreak.
At this point, the ghost's tracks changed dramatically. They became deeper, as if he had sped up, but at the same time his movements became even more economical. Raven raised his binoculars. On the horizon, through the icy haze, he could make out a dark silhouette that was not part of the glacier. It was an old, crooked hunting cabin, or perhaps a small shed.
It stood in the perfect spot from which to control the lighthouse, the village, and the entrance to the narrow bay. The ghost's tracks led straight to it, and next to them, Raven saw something that made him freeze.
A footprint, fresher than the previous ones, but not belonging to the ghost. It was the mark of a heavy work boot, very similar to those worn in Zakamensky. Someone else besides Zakharov knew about the ghost's territory.
And that someone may have appeared here after the murder. There are 2 of us here, Shadow, Raven whispered, but it seems like the whole village is involved in the game.
And they're following our trail.
The disturbance was much wider than just one murder at the lighthouse. Raven sat on a box in his temporary headquarters, a small, damp-smelling room in the police station, looking at a map of the coast.
Chapter 6 ended with the discovery of a fresh, foreign trail in the ghost's presumed territory.
This trail belonged to someone from the village, and it indicated that the hunt for the scientific collection from the wrecked Arctic wind was in full swing. And Zakharov was not the only one who knew about the cache.
The main question now was not who killed Zakharov, but why? And why the ghost, so calculating and adaptable, committed this crime in plain sight, near his hideout. In the wild, a predator does not kill where it lives.
If he killed, then the threat was existential. The victim was not just a nuisance to him, but a violation of order. The Raven summoned Maxim Zakharov, the son of the murdered man. He knew that Maxim was hiding something, but now he understood that it was not the crime itself he was hiding, but his father's secret. He decided to change tactics, appealing not to facts, but to Maxim's feelings of guilt and fear.
"Your father was afraid," Voron began, his gaze, heavy as an Arctic stone, fixed on Maxim's face. "He was afraid for 30 years. But he wasn't afraid of the ghost. He was afraid that the ghost would return and take back what belonged only to him."
Is that right? Maxim flinched. He clenched his fists, but his eyes betrayed him. "These are fabrications, the ravings of an old man. My father, he was simply obsessed with the legend." "Legends don't carry tools for opening things, Maxim," Voron interrupted sharply. "Your father went to the lighthouse with a purpose, and he wasn't going to talk to the ghost. He was going to take his stash." "Tell me about that first meeting 30 years ago. What exactly did your father see?" Maxim finally broke down. At first, the words came out stifled, then in a flood. His father, as a teenager, stumbled upon the ghost by accident when he was pulling something out of an icy crevice near the lighthouse. It was not a chest, not gold, but a metal container wrapped in tarpaulin. Without saying a word, the ghost simply pushed the teenager into the snow and disappeared. But Zakharov Sr. saw what was inside the container. Something that glowed with a dim, cold light. "Since then, my father has been obsessed," Maxim explained, his voice trembling. He searched through every archive he could find. He realized that it wasn't treasure, but the very scientific collection from the Arctic wind. He believed it was some kind of rare mineral, or maybe even a source of energy. He thought the ghost had stolen his destiny by stealing it. He said it belonged to us, humans, not to the beast. The raven listened without interrupting. Here it was, the true motive of the hunter Zakharov. Not just greed, but greed wrapped in an obsession with justice. He wanted to return the ghost to the category of human beings in order to deprive him of his right to this treasure. From Zakharov's point of view, he was right. A treasure that could help the whole world should not be in the hands of a savage. "Your father believed that the ghost had broken human law by surviving and taking what belonged to others," Voron summed up. "And he went to restore his order. But he broke the ghost's natural law, the law of territorial inviolability. And in the Arctic, that is a mortal sin." Maxim confirmed that his father had recently made a drawing of a homemade device to pull the container out of the crevice near the lighthouse, where, in his opinion, the ghost had hidden it. He went there to take back what was his, and the ghost stopped him. So that's why he wasn't afraid of the ghost, but was afraid that the ghost would take it back, said Voron. Zakharov lived with the idea that the ghost owed him something. That's where the dog is buried, the principle of the victim and the predator. The raven understood that Zakharov had acted not as a victim, but as a predator who had invaded someone else's territory. He took a risk that proved fatal. And the ghost, he was simply the guardian of his own survival. Murder was an act of self-preservation in his world, where there are no courts or prosecutors, only life and death. Now Raven had to figure out what this glowing material was and where it had gone after Zakharov's murder. After all, if Zakharov couldn't take it, the ghost most likely hid it, or it was taken by the one who left a fresh mark on the solder, the one who, perhaps, waited for Zakharov and the ghost to eliminate each other. Raven let Maxim go.
His son left, freed from the burden of secrecy. Raven, left alone, picked up his binoculars again. He looked at the crooked hunting cabin on the cape that he had noticed yesterday. Whoever left the fresh footprint must be someone from the village. And he was also hunting. "There are 3 of us here, Shadow," Raven whispered. "The Guardian, the dead hunter, and the new hunter. And me. This is no longer a hunt, but a battle for order." Raven felt that the center of gravity had shifted from Ghost to the village. If one of the villagers knew about the cache and was waiting for the right moment, it meant that the village wasn't just lying to hide Ghost. The village was actively participating in this hunt. And now this new hunter could try to get to the Ghost or the hiding place while Raven distracted attention. Raven needed to immediately move towards the lighthouse and that hut to get ahead of the second predator and prevent a new round of imbalance. And in this rush, he had to be as careful as possible so as not to become a victim himself. Tomorrow was to be a day not of reading, but of action. He had to enter the Ghost's territory to find what had cost Zakharov his life and what had possibly cost the Ghost his sanity. Raven got up. He knew that he was not going after a murderer, but after the truth that would restore the natural order, even if that truth did not coincide with human law. He had to act according to his code of honor. After Maxim Zakharov's revelations, Raven no longer saw the village of Zakamensky as a gathering of frightened citizens. He saw an ecosystem in which the legend of the Ghost was not just a myth, but a tool of control. Fear of the mystical protector of the cache allowed those who knew the truth to manipulate the rest. Voron understood that in order to find the second hunter who had left a trail on the ice, he had to apply his tracking skills not to rocks and ice, but to people. Raven left the station. The village, which at first seemed monolithically closed, now looked like an anthill, where beneath the apparent calm, a struggle for resources was raging. The first person to arouse suspicion was, of course, Arkady Sviridov, the shop owner and the only intermediary between the settlement and the outside world. His wealth, which did not correspond to Zakamensky's meager income, had always been suspicious. Voron did not question Sviridov, but went to his store. It was his lair. Voron did not look at the price tags or buy anything. He read the store, the location of the goods, their condition, Sviridov's reaction to his presence. Sviridov was cordial, but his constantly darting eyes betrayed the nervous tension he was trying to hide behind a show of friendliness. The most telling clue was the presence of goods that shouldn't have been there. Expensive, high-quality diving equipment, packaged as if it had never been used, and elite alcohol that was clearly not intended for local fishermen. Contraband, Voron concluded quietly. Sviridov used the remoteness of the village for illegal trade, and perhaps he used the same channel to hunt for his scientific collection. Sviridov, nervous under Voron's heavy, unblinking gaze, tried to steer the conversation toward the legend.
Ivan Andreevich, I told Glebov. It's the Ghost. 100%. I saw him with my own eyes. A flash at the lighthouse. The Ghost doesn't drink French cognac, Sviridov. Voron cut him off, pointing to the expensive bottle on the top shelf.
And he doesn't use city tools. You're not lying about the Ghost. You're lying about Zakharov. Your alibi for the night of the murder was solid. You were asleep at home. But Zakharov wasn't the only one hunting. You knew about the stash, too. Sviridov paled, his broad, puffy face wrinkling. He tried to wave it off, but Voron didn't let him speak. Maxim told us about the glowing container. Did you know about it? You must have known more about Arctic wind than Anna Ignatievna. Did you wait for old Zakharov, obsessed with justice, to go after the ghost himself, so you could collect the prize later? You used the ghost as a cover, Sviridov. The legend is your business plan. Voron, without waiting for an answer, left the store. He realized that Sviridov knew about the cash, but he wasn't the one who left the mark on the solder. Sviridov was too calculating and cowardly for such a risk.
He was a scavenger who waited for others to die. But his alibi needed to be checked. In the evening, Raven used binoculars to take up a position on a hill behind the village, from where he could see all the houses and paths.
He watched as the village prepared for sleep. He read the lights in the windows, the smoke from the chimneys, the sounds. He noticed something unusual in Sviridov's house. While the entire village was immersed in a deep, Arctic sleep, a dim light burned in the shop window. Raven, taking advantage of the cover of darkness, moved closer. Through a gap in the curtain, he saw that Sviridov was not trading.
He was sitting at a table studying old nautical charts. Next to him lay papers covered with calculations relating to sea currents and depths. Voron understood. Sviridov was not just a smuggler.
He was looking for something more than just a collection. He was looking for the source. He was not afraid of the ghost, but of the fact that the ghost knew the location of a ship that could contain much more than one container.
His wealth was probably based on what the ghost or the sunken ship had washed ashore.
When Raven returned to the station, Glebov, tired and gloomy, reported that he had been unable to find any records of the light Maxim had described.
Maybe his father made it up, Ivan Andreevich, to give weight to his obsession?
No, replied Voron, staring into the darkness. Light cannot be invented. There was a glow, but it was not natural. It was radiation, or phosphorus, or something from that very scientific collection that was lying in the tarpaulin. This explained why Zakharov Sr. had never been able to retrieve the container, and why the ghost had been so desperate in his defense.
If it was radiation, the ghost was not only the guardian, but also the victim. The village lied. It lied out of fear, greed, and ignorance. But Sviridov's lie was active. He wasn't just hiding, he was searching. Voron made a decision.
He had to get ahead of Sviridov and whoever had left the fresh tracks. Tonight, he had to check Ghost's territory, the lighthouse, and the crooked hut on the cape.
He needed to get to the cache to understand what Ghost was guarding and what Zakharov was trying to steal. Only then could the disturbed balance be restored.
"We're leaving, Shadow," Raven said to the dog, who immediately raised his head as if understanding every word.
He took his knife, binoculars, and a supply of ammunition. It was a hunt.
Not for a man, but for the truth hidden under a layer of ice, legends, and human greed. The disturbed order must be restored. Raven went outside. The night was thick. Snow was beginning to fall, and the tracks he left behind would be quickly noticed. It was the last night that the ghost could remain untouched. The night over Zakamensk was not just dark, it was heavy, filled with falling snow that tightly enveloped the village, erasing all traces and making the world monotonous and death. In such weather, predators do not hunt, they wait. But Raven couldn't wait, because he knew that Sviridov was also awake, and every hour of delay could cost the ghost his refuge, or, worse, lead to new, unnecessary bloodshed. Raven and Shadow moved toward the lighthouse. The snow, fresh and fluffy, muffled the sound of their footsteps. The wind picked up, turning the snow into prickly dust. Raven did not use a lantern, relying on his night vision and shadow, who served as his eyes on the ground. They climbed to the base of the lighthouse. Zakharov, killed here, was not a victim, but a guard dog, neutralized by the real guardian. Now Raven, ignoring the official yellow tape that Glebov had stretched out for order, approached the heavy, rusted door. It was ajar, which Raven had not noticed during his daytime inspection. The ghost knew how to use fear. If the door had been locked, it would have aroused suspicion. If it was ajar, people would blame it on the wind and not dare to enter, fearing that the ghost was inside. Raven entered. Inside, there was absolute Arctic cold, and the smell of stale sea air mixed with the smell of ozone, and something elusively bitter. The ghost lived here, and he had lived here for a long time. Climbing the spiral staircase was like climbing the spine of a frozen beast. The steps were slippery, broken in places. But Raven, with his years of experience navigating rough terrain, moved almost silently. He read the lighthouse like a book, in which every rust stain and every shard of glass was a word. Traces of the ghost's presence were everywhere, but they were incredibly neat. No dirt, no trash. The dust was neatly swept into corners, and on the windowsills, despite the winter, lay bundles of dry, Arctic grass, apparently serving as insulation. This was not a man who had gone mad, but a man who had elevated his survival to the level of ritual. On the upper level, in the former caretaker's room, Voron stopped. This was where the ghost spent most of his time. On the stone floor lay a thick, old blanket, sewn from various pieces of fur and canvas. And next to it was a primitive but functional hearth made of several stones, and a piece of an old barrel. A blackened kettle hung above the hearth. Everything spoke of a long, conscious stay. The shadow walked around the room and stopped at a niche where a radio telegraph had once stood. The Raven approached. The niche was protected from the wind by old, thick boards, and inside it, wrapped in a piece of tarred canvas, lay a small, badly damaged leather object. It was a ship's log. Raven carefully unwrapped the tarpaulin. The leather binding was cracked from age and dampness, but the paper inside, thanks to the tarpaulin and the dry Arctic air, was surprisingly well preserved. On the cover, almost worn away, was the inscription, "Arctic Wind." Raven began to read. The handwriting was neat and formal, apparently belonging to the first mate. The entries led up to the day of the crash, the storm, engine failure, collision with ice, and then a sharp change in handwriting made in pencil, a personal diary. The last entries, made by the surviving crew member, the name had been erased at the beginning, but from the context, Raven understood that it was the mechanic, described the horrors of survival, the death of comrades, and most importantly, rescue.
The text was not about treasure, but about duty.
We were carrying it, and we had to deliver it. I am the only one left. Duty. Duty does not leave me. I must protect it from the sea, from people. The mechanic, having become a ghost, did not go mad from loneliness. He took on a mission. He used his engineering savvy to adapt the lighthouse and the coast for living. He was a man of duty who decided that the cargo, whatever it was, must not fall into the wrong hands. And then, on one of the last pages, Raven found what he was looking for, a brief but comprehensive description of the cargo. Container number 3. Scientific samples of rare minerals for energy research. They glow in the dark. It was not a golden treasure, but something that could become either a great blessing or a terrible weapon. And that completely explained Zakharov's obsession and Sviridov's greed.
He kept the balance, Shadow, Raven whispered, closing the logbook. He was not a criminal. He was a guardian, and Zakharov became a thief who disturbed the peace. Now Raven knew. The ghost was Vladimir Korotkov, the ship's mechanic from the Arctic wind, a survivor who had transformed himself into a guardian. And he was real, and he knew that Raven was in his lair. Voron felt the tension in the lighthouse intensify. He raised his head. A faint, scattered light fell from the observation window, where the lantern had once stood. But Voron was sure it was not the light of a lantern. It was an eye. He knew that Korotkov was watching him from the cape, from the very crooked hut where the tracks led. Raven picked up the logbook. The discovery confirmed that the ghost controlled not only the lighthouse, but the entire territory. And now he saw that his refuge had been desecrated. It was time to move on, toward the source of the threat. Before leaving, Raven left a neatly folded handful of dried berries on the table, which he had brought with him from the Taiga. A gesture of forgiveness and recognition. It was his personal code. Respect for someone else's territory. He left the lighthouse. The snow continued to fall, covering his tracks. But his destination was not the hut. He needed to find the hiding place that Zakharov had written about. If Korotkov hadn't moved it after the murder, it should still be where the ghost had left it 30 years ago, in a crevice at the base of the lighthouse. This was his point of no return. Voron left the lighthouse with the ship's log under his arm, feeling like a man who had just invaded a temple. He hadn't just found the diary. He had broken a vow, an oath that Vladimir Korotkov, the ghost, had made 30 years ago, becoming the keeper of a dangerous, glowing secret. Raven knew that his gesture, a handful of dry berries left on the table, was not enough. From the cape where the crooked hut stood, he was being watched. The goal was now clear: to find the crevice at the base of the lighthouse that Zakharov Jr. had mentioned. If the container with rare minerals was still there, it meant that Korotkov had not moved it after the murder, but simply covered it up. If the crevice was empty, it confirmed that someone, possibly the new hunter from the village, had already beaten Raven to it. The snow was getting heavier. Voron descended to the rocky foot of the lighthouse, where the waves of the Arctic Ocean crashed against the basalt cliffs. But now everything was frozen solid. The shadow walked ahead, its black fur almost blending into the background. It behaved not like a hunting dog, but like a guide, alert but without aggression. Raven stopped. Here, amid the chaos of frozen boulders, rocks, and sea debris, he saw the tracks he was looking for. These were the tracks left by the ghost after killing Zakharov, and they differed from his usual, almost meditative gait. He was in a hurry, Raven whispered. Longer strides, nervous foot placement. This is not a normal departure. This is a flight. Korotkov's tracks led to a narrow, dark crevice that was impossible to see from the shore. It was a natural storage room, created by the ocean and time. Raven illuminated the crevice with a small flashlight that he usually used to read tracks in the twilight. Inside, at the bottom, he saw something that made him freeze. The crevice was empty, but it was not clean. At the bottom, covered with small pebbles,
There were clear traces, deep grooves from a heavy rectangular object dragged across the stones. And most importantly, traces of fresh ice. The water that had entered the crevice when the container was removed had frozen only recently. The container was taken, and it wasn't taken by the ghost. Voron's conclusion was instantaneous and indisputable. The fresh ice, which would have quickly evaporated or been covered by snow, indicated that this had happened only a few hours ago, while Voron was sitting in the police station. This was the point of no return. Zakarov's murder was just one link in the chain. Whoever took the container knew about it, knew about the conflict between Zakharov and Korotkov, and cold-bloodedly waited for Ghost to eliminate the old hunter. Voron raised his head. Now he knew that the second hunter he had been thinking about was not just a curious resident. He was an opportunistic criminal who acted with calculated efficiency. He followed Korotkov's tracks, found the cache, and took the most valuable items. The Raven quickly looked around. Near the crevice, slightly covered by fresh snow, lay 2 footprints. One belonged to the ghost, the other to the intruder. But this new footprint was now clearer. The footwear was not local, not hunting boots, but rubber boots with thick soles, often worn by people associated with the sea or smuggling. Sviridov, the name of the shop owner and unofficial leader of the village, flashed through Voron's mind. It all made sense. His greed, his sea charts, his nervousness. Sviridov had most likely used Zakharov as bait and the ghost as a weapon. He waited. Voron turned to go back, but at that moment Shadow, who had been sitting quietly nearby, growled low. The growl was not vicious, but warning. The Raven froze instantly. He heard no footsteps or the sound of an engine through the roar of the wind. He relied only on Shadow's hearing and his 6th sense. "Quiet," he whispered. He looked around, using his bird of prey's attentiveness. Nothing. Only black rocks and white, swirling snow. And then he saw it. Not movement, but a lack of movement. A dark, indistinct figure stood by his all-terrain vehicle, parked on the road 100 meters from the lighthouse. The figure was motionless, as if it were part of the rock. A moment later, there was a dull, metallic sound, which was immediately swallowed up by the wind. They distracted us, Raven realized. While I was reading the lighthouse, they were working. They know what I know. Without saying a word, Raven ran toward the all-terrain vehicle, Shadow silently rushing alongside him. The figure disappeared. But when Raven approached, he saw that the snow around the all-terrain vehicle had been trampled, and a broken branch was sticking out of the gas tank. Damage to the vehicle. It was a clear, unambiguous threat from the village. Not murder, but a warning. Stop. You are a stranger. Do not disturb our order. Raven pulled out the branch. The gas tank wasn't punctured, but judging by the smell, something corrosive, possibly sugar or salt, had been poured inside to disable the engine. Cunning, petty sabotage, but would leave no traces. "They're playing their city game, Shadow," Raven said, looking contemptuously at the settlement where rare lights flickered. "Their thirst for the cargo has made them lose their fear of the ghost and find courage against me." But Raven felt no anger. He felt professional hunger. Now he had not just a corpse, but a living, active criminal who had tried to interfere with his work. Now he had to not only find Korotkov, but also get ahead of Sviridov. He quickly but methodically searched the area, following the tracks of the person who had left the gift in the tank. The tracks were fast, nervous, and led straight to the village. They belonged to a third person, not Sviridov, but probably his henchman, who was running errands. Voron knew that Sviridov and the container were in the village, and Korotkov, having lost his stash, must now be in a state of despair and rage. Voron made a decision. Before returning to the village, he had to find Korotkov. Only he could shed light on the true value of the minerals and provide answers that would restore the natural order. Korotkov, deprived of his cargo, was now a wounded beast that would flee far away. And Voron, following the laws of the wild, had to follow his trail, leading into the icy wilderness. And it was there, into the icy wilderness, to an abandoned hut, but Voron directed his all-terrain vehicle, trying not to disturb the engine. It was a race against Sviridov and time itself. And this race led to the very edge of the Arctic. Voron drove the all-terrain vehicle carefully, trying not to disturb the engine, into which something corrosive had been poured. He moved toward the crooked hut, which he assumed the ghost, Vladimir Korotkov, used as an observation point and backup shelter. It was a race against Sviridov, who was probably already rejoicing at having seized the glowing container, and against Korotkov himself, who, having lost his duty, could now be unpredictable. The further they drove from the village, the more the Arctic reclaimed its rights. The road disappeared, giving way to ice ridges, snow-covered rocks, and an endless white desert. Raven sensed that Shadow, sitting next to him, was tense. The dog could smell not only the wild man, but also the change in him. Anger, despair. The trail that Raven began to read at the lighthouse was barely visible. Korotkov moved along the ice, using old paths known only to him. He placed his feet as precisely as possible, avoiding loose snow and looking for solid footing. This trail was a testament to his survival skills, but now there was a hint of carelessness in it. The steps were too quick, too decisive, like those of a man who had lost his goal and was now simply running, following his instincts. The trail led them to a cape where an old hut, warped by time and wind, stood. It was built of driftwood and was unlike any other local structure. It might once have been a refuge for geologists or fishermen, but now it was abandoned and blended into the landscape. Raven turned off the engine behind a small hill and took out his binoculars. There were no lights on in the hut, and there was no smoke. This was unusual. In such cold weather, someone would have to be heating it. "He's gone," Raven said quietly. But Shadow growled even more quietly, pointing his nose at the rocks behind the hut. Raven understood. Korotkov wasn't waiting for him in the hut. He was too smart for that. He had gone higher, to the rocks, to watch. Raven and Shadow left the all-terrain vehicle and moved toward the hut on foot, silently, like shadows. The hut was empty, but, like the lighthouse, it was neatly furnished. Raven found supplies of dried meat, a primitive but effective trap for small game, and even a few homemade tools for sewing and repairing. There were no signs of panic except for one. On the table where Korotkov had probably been eating, there was a plate with uneaten, frozen fish. A man who plans every day so carefully would not leave food behind. Something had distracted him, and that something was undoubtedly Zakharov. And then the loss of the container. Voron took his binoculars out of his pocket and slowly, without sudden movements, scanned the rocks. He knew that Korotkov must be there, above.
Voron's code of honor,
demanded a direct confrontation, but his instinct for self-preservation dictated caution. Korotkov was wounded, and a wounded beast is more dangerous than a predator. "He's not a killer by nature," Raven mused. "He's a guardian." He killed because his territory was violated, and his mission was threatened. Now, there is no mission. What is keeping him here? The answer came naturally when Voron noticed movement on the rocks. Not a person, but two white foxes that jumped aside in fear. These were foxes, whose natural reaction to humans in this place would be curiosity, not fear. Someone had frightened them. Raven headed for the place where the foxes had run from. There, in a narrow, wind-protected niche, was Korotkov. He was sitting, leaning against a cold rock. His clothes were skillfully sewn from skins, but they didn't look dirty or worn. They were simply a part of him. Long hair, almost white from age and sun, hid his face, but his eyes were open when he raised his head. They were old and tired, but they burned with the same intense, unblinking gaze that had earned Raven his nickname. "I knew you would come." Korotkov's voice was quiet and hoarse, like the crunch of ice. "You're not like them. You read." The shadow sat quietly next to Raven, without growling or barking. The dog saw Korotkov not as a man, but as the spirit of the place. "Ivan Andreevich Belov," Raven introduced himself. "I came because you killed a man, Vladimir." He wanted to steal something that didn't belong to him, Korotkov did not deny. He tried to take it 3 times. I warned him. I told him it was dangerous. He didn't listen. He was obsessed with the light. He broke the rules. A psychological battle began, rather than a physical one. Voron had the ship's log, which proved that Korotkov was not the ghost, but a mechanic. But he did not use it as a weapon. "He's dead, and the container is gone. Sviridov took it," Voron said, watching Korotkov's reaction. Korotkov's face, as if carved from ice, trembled. His eyes narrowed and cold fury flashed in them. "Sviridov? He's a rat. He doesn't understand what he took." "Explain." The ship's log mentions rare minerals. For energy research. "What is it, Vladimir?" Voron crouched down, urging him to confide in him. Korotkov didn't answer right away. He raised his hand, pointing to his skin. It was pale, almost transparent, with spots. Radiation. Not strong, but constant. Samples. They were packed. We knew the risk. I stayed to bury it, to drown it, to hide it, but not to let greedy hands get it. I was a grave digger for 30 years, not a treasure keeper. Voron felt his code of honor, based on the laws of nature, waver. Korotkov had killed, but he had killed to protect the ecosystem and people from a danger they themselves were unaware of. He was a filter, standing in the way of great human greed. Zakharov wanted to sell it. His son, Maxim, he told me about the light. He thought it was gold, said Voron. But Sviridov, he was looking for it deliberately. He knows about smuggling. He can sell it to anyone. Korotkov nodded. I saw him watching. I saw him on the shore. But Zakharov was closer. He was already in the grave. I had to stop him. Voron understood. Korotkov had chosen the lesser evil. He had stopped the immediate threat, Zakharov, but now a bigger predator had appeared, Sviridov.
I know what you're looking for. You're looking for order. Korotkov looked Voron straight in the eye. I broke the law of men to preserve the law of the land. Now the order has been broken by Sviridov. He brought radiation to the village.
What will you do, Hunter? It was not a question, but a challenge. Korotkov, having lost his cargo, offered Voron his cross. I will return the cargo to its place, Voron replied.
And you will tell Glebov everything you know. Korotkov laughed, but it was a bitter, dry laugh. I'm not going back to the city. I'm not part of your world. You will return to restore order. Raven cut him off. You will tell the truth, if not for the people, then for the land you defended. Voron knew he couldn't turn Korotkov in. His crime was philosophical, his motive moral. But he couldn't let him go while the container was still in the village. Where did Sviridov hide it?
He couldn't have carried it far across the ice,
Voron said, turning to practical matters. Korotkov, looking intently at Voron, raised his hand and pointed to one of the distant buildings in the village, which Voron had previously mistaken for an old warehouse. The fuel storage. Sviridov took it from there. He'll return it there. But that's not the main thing, Voron. The main thing is, this cargo attracts evil. It always follows. You must be ready. Voron nodded. He took Korotkov by the hand. It was a gesture that spoke louder than words. Recognition. They were both outsiders, bound by a code of honor and a desire to restore balance. And now they were walking together against the greed of the village. Let's go. My vehicle is broken. We'll walk. And you'll show me how to move so as to be invisible, said Raven. The climax had been reached. The mythical man had been found. His truth was bitter but honest, and now Raven had to become a little bit of a ghost himself, to return what belonged to nature. Raven and Korotkov sat in a rock niche, behind which the Arctic, snow and wind raged. The shadow dozed nearby. The air here was thin and cold, but a fragile balance had been established between these two men, equally weathered by nature and disappointment. Korotkov told his story, and it turned out to be more prosaic and terrifying than any legend about gold. He was not the keeper of a treasure, but a voluntary guardian of the burial ground. The ship Arctic Wind was not carrying contraband in the usual sense. Korotkov's voice was quiet, like sand being blown by the wind. It was carrying samples of ore with a high content of rare earth elements. They were needed for a new energy project. We were told that it was valuable cargo. We weren't told that it was deadly dangerous. There was a fire in the wheelhouse, and then a storm. We lost everything, except for this container. Korotkov explained that after the crash, he, the only surviving mechanic, understood the true nature of the light. The very phosphorescent glow that Maxim Zakharov had described. It was radiation, not a strong explosion, but a constant, slow poisoning. The crew died not only from the cold, but also from radiation sickness. I saw how people changed, how they broke down. I saw my captain die. Korotkov ran his hand over his face, as if wiping away 30 years of dust. He made me promise. This cargo must not fall into the hands of people who will use it blindly for profit. It must be buried.
For 30 years, Korotkov, a mechanic, became the ghost grave digger. He set up the lighthouse as a temporary base, and then the crevice as an eternal crypt. He lived off the sea, avoiding the village, and checked his cross every day. His murder of Zakharov was not an act of revenge, but an act of self-defense of the ecosystem.
Zakharov, obsessed with the legend of glowing gold, tried to open the container. I stopped him. I didn't let him bring it out into the light. Korotkov fell silent, his eyes empty.
I broke the law of men to fulfill the law of the land. Listening to him, Voron felt his inner code of honor, based on the laws of nature, accept this murder as a necessary removal of a diseased individual from the ecosystem.
Zakharov, greedy and obsessed, was a source of threat to the village, much more frightening than the ghost itself. Sviridov is the real predator, concluded the Raven, his voice low and heavy.
He knew what he was looking for, or at least knew it was valuable to sell. He used the legend to cover up his schemes. He waited for you to eliminate the competition, then took the cargo. Korotkov nodded. I saw him watching. He's a rat that eats corpses. He hid it in an old fuel storage facility on the edge of the village. It's dark and quiet there, and he thinks it belongs to him. Voron stood up. The philosophical part of the investigation was over. Now the hunt began. The killer had been found, his motive understood. But the true evil, the real threat to order, now lay in the hands of the store owner, Arkady Sviridov. The greed of the village, their collective silence, their fear of the legend, all of this was a screen for crimes committed under the cover of myth. We'll put him back where he belongs, said Voron. And you'll come with me to restore order. Not as a criminal, as a witness and guardian. Korotkov stood up. He was wiry, incredibly strong for his probably 70 years. His skin was pale from radiation, but his will was harder than Arctic ice. My business is the grave, Raven. Not the city, replied the ghost. The grave awaits. But first, justice. Raven cut him off. He did not expect Korotkov to testify in court. His justice was different. It demanded that the truth be revealed and the threat eliminated. And then, exile. Korotkov, having fulfilled his duty, had to return to his element. Voron knew that his all-terrain vehicle would most likely stall at any moment. He made a decision. They would go on foot. Sviridov is waiting for nightfall to take him away, said Voron, looking at his watch. It was around midnight. The Arctic night lasted forever. We need to get there before him. Korotkov nodded, and for the first time in a long time, a shadow of something resembling combat readiness appeared on his face. He was no longer a hermit. He was a soldier, returning to the battlefield. My trails are here, Korotkov said quietly. I know where the ice is thinner, where the snow is deeper. I know where the eyes of the village cannot see. This was the last piece of the puzzle. The skill of invisible movement. Raven, the great tracker of the Taiga, was now learning from the ghost to read the tracks of ice and shadow. Let's go, said Raven, putting on his backpack, which contained the ship's log and binoculars. Shadow, having received tacit permission from both men, moved forward. But now he walked alongside Korotkov, recognizing him as an equal. They left the hut and headed for the village. But this was not a return, but an attack. They did not move along the roads, but along the very edge of the village,
using the shadows of the rocks and snow-covered ravines.
Voron saw how Korotkov placed his feet, lightly, precisely, without a single unnecessary movement, using every bump and every fold in the terrain for camouflage. It was pure animal logic. Sviridov isn't expecting us.
He thinks I've left, or been broken, Raven whispered. His greed has blinded him. They were approaching the settlement, which now seemed to Raven not just a cluster of houses, but a den of greed. Covered by a thick layer of Arctic ice and myth, the main battle lay ahead, restoring order to the human ecosystem. And Raven knew that in this world, where there was no place for city laws, he had to act according to the law of the land. The return to the village was not an entrance, but an infiltration. Raven moved along the paths that Korotkov showed him, realizing that his own skill at reading tracks was only the alphabet compared to the language this man spoke. They bypassed the roads where salt had recently been thrown into the tank of an all-terrain vehicle, moved along the edge of a snow-covered ravine, and even Shadow now walked extremely quietly, following the silent ghost. The village slept, shrouded in the Arctic night, but Raven sensed that behind every window there was a restless anticipation. Sviridov was awake. His greed and his newfound treasure gave him no peace. The target was the fuel storage facility, a low squat hangar on the outskirts that Raven had seen when they entered. They approached it from the shore, where the snow was deeper and the sounds of the ocean masked their footsteps. "He's in there," Korotkov hissed quietly, pointing to the hangar door which was open a centimeter. A thin strip of light shining through the crack, barely visible in the pitch darkness. Voron crouched down. He knew that he had to use shock and truth, not force. His task was not to arrest, but to remove the diseased element and restore balance. "We go in. You find the container. I do the talking. No violence. Just the truth," Raven whispered. Sviridov must not have time to escape or hide it again. The shadow remained at the door, its silhouette merging with the shadow of the hangar. Voron and Korotkov entered. Inside, it was warm and smelled of kerosene and fresh paint. Sviridov stood at a homemade table, lit by a dim lamp. He was dressed in a quilted jacket, and in front of him lay a nautical chart. Not a map of the Arctic, but a detailed plan of the seabed near the coast. And next to the map, covered with a tarpaulin, stood that very container. It was a square metal box, slightly scratched, but sturdy. It did not emit light in the literal sense. But Voron, who knew about radiation, felt an unhealthy heaviness in the air. Arkady. Raven's low, hoarse voice filled the space like cold air. Sviridov flinched. His reaction was pure animal panic. He wasn't expecting anyone, let alone two people. He darted to the corner where his hunting rifle lay. "Don't," said Voron, taking a step forward. "A gun won't help against the truth, Arkady." Sviridov stopped when he saw Korotkov standing next to Voron, his face contorted with superstition and fear. "A ghost." "Not a ghost." "Vladimir Korotkov, mechanic from the Arctic Wind," Raven corrected calmly, "and guardian of what you tried to steal. And Zakharov paid with his life because he was stupid. You will pay properly." Sviridov tried to regain his former tone, the tone of a master and leader. "What are you talking about? That old man is a murderer, and this is mine. Zakharov told me about the light. This is compensation for us sitting here." Voron did not argue. He took the ship's log out of his backpack. He did not give it to Sviridov, but opened it to the relevant page, where the captain described the cargo and his concerns about its safety.
Ore samples with high radiation levels, Voron read aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. Your gold, Arkady, glows not because it is valuable, but because it is poisoned.
You try to take it away to sell it to those who don't know about it, bringing death to the village and greed to the world.
Sviridov laughed nervously, hysterically.
It's all lies. A legend. He's lying.
70 years in the Arctic, Arkady.
Pale skin and slow death.
He's not lying. He's proof. Voron pointed at Korotkov. Korotkov stepped forward. He didn't say a word, but his heavy, unblinking gaze was worse than any accusation. He took off his glove, revealing a disfigured, blotchy hand. It was living proof that Korotkov was telling the truth. Sviridov backed away, the horror in his eyes no longer superstitious, but physical.
He realized that what he held in his hands was not wealth, but a curse. Voron continued, getting to the heart of his justice. He knew that if he handed Sviridov over to the police, he would still find a way out, and Korotkov would be imprisoned for murder, even if it was forced. It would be a triumph for urban disorder.
This is my verdict. The raven spoke slowly, like a judge in a dense forest. You, Arkady Sviridov, have violated the law of honor and the law of the land. You knew that Zakharov was looking for treasure, and you waited for his death. You used a myth to cover up your greed. You wanted to sell death.
Voron did not blackmail him with smuggling. He blackmailed him with fear of radiation and shame before the village. You will not get this cargo.
And you will not hide the truth, said Voron. Tomorrow, you will gather the whole village. You will tell them the true story of the ghost of the lighthouse and this container. You will tell them what you stole.
You will return the container to its place. And then you will leave this village forever. Sviridov tried to bargain, to beg, but his pathetic, greedy voice was lost on Raven's calm, stony face.
If I ever see your footprints on this shore or the shadow of your plane in the sky, I will find you, and then it will not be the law of the land, but my personal law, said Voron, and there was so much undisguised contempt in his voice that Sviridov realized he had lost. The outcome had been decided.
Sviridov, broken by fear of radiation, shame, and Raven's absolute confidence, silently collapsed into a chair. Korotkov walked over to the container and picked it up as if it were not dangerous ore, but an old book. He looked at Raven, and a quiet gratitude flashed in his eyes. Justice had been restored. Order had prevailed. Tomorrow, you will tell the truth. Voron repeated, looking at Sviridov. And we will return the container to its place. They left the hangar. The shadow pricked up his ears and led them back to the lighthouse. Korotkov walked, carrying his burden, his load, with dignity. You have returned my debt, Korotkov whispered, looking at Raven. Now I can return to my grave. Voron nodded. They both knew their work was done. Korotkov had broken human law for the sake of natural law. Voron had broken city law for the sake of the code of honor. Both had found their redemption in the Arctic. Morning came not with the sun, but with a gray, damp light that penetrated the thick Arctic fog. Voron and Korotkov spent the rest of the night at the lighthouse. They did not sleep. They returned the container to its original place in the crevice, camouflaging it so skillfully, but only the ghost could find it again. It was a ritual, not a job.
Restoring balance. Now only the human part of the sentence remained. First, Raven went to Glebov. The young police officer looked exhausted and sleep-deprived, but there was no longer helplessness in his eyes. There was heavy fatigue from understanding the scale of what had happened. Sviridov. He's gone, Glebov began, his voice trembling. I found his letter. He said he was tired of the Arctic and sold the store. He left the money in the cash register, but left. He said a buyer from Murmansk would arrive soon. Voron was not surprised. Sviridov, broken by fear of radiation and public disgrace, had chosen hasty exile. The threat he posed had been eliminated. Voron knew that his sentence was more effective than any city law. Glebov would never find evidence of smuggling or sufficient grounds for arrest. But order in the village had already begun to change. Did he mention the container? Raven asked. He left a note about old, useless minerals and asked for them to be disposed of far from the shore. Plebov rubbed his forehead. That's all. Not a word about the ghost or Zakharov. It was a half-truth that satisfied the system. Glebov got a murder that could now be chalked up to an interpersonal conflict between hunters, ending in an accidental fall from the lighthouse. Just as Sviridov wanted, but with his own departure. Glebov got rid of the source of tension, Sviridov. The city law was satisfied with fiction. Voron knew that rumors would immediately spread throughout the village. Anna Ignatievna, who had received the ship's log, and Maxim, who had seen the container, would not remain silent. The true, bitter truth about radiation and Korotkov's sacrifice would slowly, like seawater, permeate the Arctic charter of the village. Voron headed for the lighthouse. Korotkov was standing there, carrying a container wrapped in tarpaulin. Are you coming? Voron asked. Korotkov shook his head. He was pale, and the radiation had taken its toll. But there was peace in his eyes. My duty is done. My grave is here, said the ghost. He handed Voron the ship's log. This is for you, as proof, if you need it. Raven took the book. It was both evidence and a philosophical treatise, proof of Korotkov's existence, his suffering, and his feat. Are you staying here? Asked the Raven. I am a ghost. I must be invisible. Korotkov smiled a thin, bitter smile. You have restored order. Now I will return to the elements. Voron did not try to persuade him. He understood that Korotkov was a wild animal that could not be kept in a cage. His life outside society was his choice and his redemption. Raven shook his hand. A shadow licked Korotkov's face as he said goodbye. Ivan Andreevich Belov repaired his all-terrain vehicle. He used his skills to do it quickly and cleanly. He started the engine, and its roar broke the morning silence. He turned around one last time. The lighthouse, the fog, the shore. Everything was in its place. Korotkov was no longer visible. He had disappeared, as befits a ghost. The Raven and the Shadow had left. What did you leave them? He asked himself, as the all-terrain vehicle slowly crawled along the snow-covered roads. He left the village with the truth wrapped in myth
and justice imposed from outside. The village did not receive a clear conscience, but the heavy knowledge that greed can be more deadly than any Arctic beast, and that their own fear of the ghost was only a screen for their fear of their own greed. For Raven, it was another victory in his personal war against disorder. He had restored balance. The killer, Korotkov, was forgiven, according to the law of the land, because his motive was pure. The greedy one, Sviridov, was banished. The danger, radiation, was localized. He felt the calm that always came after he had put everything back in its place. His code of honor, based on the laws of nature, remained unbroken. He was deeply indifferent to what Glebov would write in his report. Order had been restored, but not according to human laws, but according to the laws of nature. The ghost had returned to its element. The raven in the shadow rode south. Ahead lay the boundless, cold, and honest Siberian taiga, where tracks do not lie, and where every action has its natural consequence. A quiet smile froze on his lips. He knew that the secret of the old lighthouse remained undisclosed to the world, but it had been solved for him, in full accordance with the law that stood above all codes. And in this there was true justice.